Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely mind-bending macro investment report. We're looking at a radical framework for understanding the era we're living in right now. It's an executive-level briefing on something called geocosmic determinism, and how that concept directly maps to the massive economic shifts projected for the next decade.
So are global shocks entirely predictable? I mean, since the pandemic in 2020, it really has felt like just one random geopolitical crisis after another, right? Well, the source material we're breaking down today argues the exact opposite. It suggests that all this chaos actually has a hidden, measurable structure. It's a cyclical blueprint that we can trace and, most importantly, prepare for.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to walk through the report's highly structured, logical sequence. We'll hit 5 main areas today: the macro thesis, the catalyst timeline, the Great Reconstruction, Mars versus Venus paradigms, and finally, the technological backbone.
All right, jumping right into Section 1, the macro thesis, which maps the 250-yard arc connecting 1771 to today.
The foundation of this entire report rests on a massive 250-year geocosmic arc. The thesis points out that the last time we went through a transition of this exact magnitude was way back in 1771. That was the last time a specific astrological marker, known as the Venus star point, hit an exact alignment of 29 degrees Libra. The authors make the case that what we're living through right now is the completion of that cycle, effectively mirroring the huge monumental shifts of the late 18th century.
The historical parallel here is absolutely staggering. Think about 1771 for a second. That era was defined by the discovery of Uranus, the advent of steam power, and this massive pivot from agrarian societies to centralized industrialism. It literally birthed the modern world as we know it. Now map that onto the 2032 era. The report links our current transition to the astrological placement of Uranus in Gemini. But obviously, instead of steam power, the engines of this shift are artificial intelligence and decentralized finance. Structurally, we're moving from a centralized hierarchical society into a decentralized algorithmic network. And the source insists this is an event of equal, if not greater magnitude.
That brings us to Section 2, the catalyst timeline, where we map the volatility from 2020 through 2026. Let's actually dive into this timeline to see how it builds, because the report views our recent global shocks not as isolated flukes, but as a holistic 12-year process of deconstruction. It kicks off with the foundation phase in 2020, marked by the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. This was basically the Great Reset, triggering a silent but permanent erosion of trust in centralized authorities. Fast forward to now, and we're entering what they call the Great Pivot of 2025 and 2026. This is where the old guard directly confronts the emerging reality. The real flashpoints? Those are mapped specifically to 2026. First up is the February 2026 cardinal ingress, an astrological marker the report claims will collapse the illusions surrounding international law and global trade. Then we hit the fire peak in July 2026. This is a high-tension Mars-Uranus alignment that acts as a cosmic catalyst for sudden, factual transformation. The old world definitively loses its grip here, making way for totally unpredictable technological breakthroughs.
But after the shocks comes the rebuilding. Let's move to Section 3, the Great Reconstruction, building the 2032 systemic plateau.
To really grasp this reconstruction phase, we have to understand its core concept, which the report calls algorithmic transparency. This is a decentralized model where AI-driven logic and blockchain integrity completely step in to replace institutional authority. So think about central banks losing their status as the primary arbiters of trust. The core assertion is massive. Trust is fundamentally shifting away from physical, sovereign control and moving directly into cryptographic truth.
The source breaks this reconstruction down into a really specific step-by-step framework, and the momentum here is pretty incredible. Step 1 runs through 2027 with Uranus in Gemini acting as the astrological backbone for radical innovation. This is when blockchain and AI fully integrate into the global GDP. Then Step 2 hits in 2028 with a Mars-Sun conjunction in Aries. This is critical because it's when those theoretical digital models finally manifest as physical, concrete social, and state structures. And finally, Step 3 brings us to the 2032 systemic plateau. The wild volatility of the 2020s levels off, and a stabilized, decentralized global norm officially takes the wheel.
Now for Section 4, Mars versus Venus paradigms, where we explore the direct clash of the old and new worlds.
This perfectly illustrates the core clash at the heart of this thesis. We are transitioning out of an old pyramidal Martian model, defined by top-down control, and stepping directly into a decentralized, networked Venusian reality. You can see how the economic engine shifts from centralized industrial capital over to decentralized, AI-driven agentic economies. At the same time, authority transitions from central banks relying on institutional trust to DeFi running entirely on algorithmic transparency. But honestly, the most shocking shift is the primary value driver. We're moving away from physical assets sanctioned by legacy institutions and toward pure information dominance. It is a total inversion of how global power is operated for decades.
So, what's the astrological catalyst for this clash? It's mapped directly to the Venus star point. According to the report, Venus is finishing up a 100-year term in Scorpio and shifting into Libra. It's essentially transforming from a Capricorn morning star into a Libra evening star. But the source throws in another crucial, honestly almost mystical detail. Venus is accompanied by Haumea, a Kuiper Belt object named after the Hawaiian goddess of birth. This specific celestial event is said to carry a quantum potential that births an entirely new era, one rooted mathematically in the Fibonacci golden ratio. It's all about harmony and beauty, aiming to shift our collective values toward these new network protocols. I've got to say, it's probably the wildest part of the entire thesis.
Naturally, you might be wondering how all this esoteric macro theory translates into hyper-tangible investments. That brings us to Section 5, the technological backbone, exploring the drivers of the Venusian network.
What does this look like in practice? Well, let's look at NVIDIA. The report identifies them as the indispensable architect of this AI revolution. Their hardware is quite literally the backbone powering the AI factories of the 2032 paradigm. This is largely driven by their transition to the Vera Rubin platform right around 2026. And guess what? That perfectly aligns with the Uranus and Gemini cycle, which the authors argue heavily favors explosive growth in compute as a commodity. But it is not without massive systemic risk. The report specifically warns of severe supply chain vulnerabilities hitting right during that July 2026 fire peak we talked about earlier.
Next up is Alphabet, the poster child for information dominance. They are viewed as the primary stewards integrating AI into the global social fabric, mainly through their Gemini models and proprietary hardware like TPUs. The report even highlights Waymo as the physical realization of AI, literally bringing digital intelligence off the servers and into the physical world. But there is a huge catch here. As legacy models collapse around the 0-degree Aries ingress, Alphabet faces profound systemic risk from antitrust exposure. The geocosmic cycle strongly indicates an aggressive deconstruction of old monopolistic illusions.
And finally, we have SpaceX and Starlink providing the physical global infrastructure. If this new paradigm is truly decentralized and networked, it desperately needs a way to bypass terrestrial and sovereign constraints. Starlink achieves exactly that by connecting sovereign free zones and crisis areas directly from space. It's a radical concept, a literal escape from terrestrial borders. On top of that, the report positions the Starship program as absolutely vital to that 2028 physical realization cycle, basically enabling an entirely new frontier of industrial development. But of course, rising geopolitical tensions during the 2026 shocks pose a major systemic risk to their satellite deployments.
Okay, so let's tie this all together into an actionable institutional strategy. The report lays out a very strict mandate: aggressive reallocation. Capital has to pivot away from centralized pyramidal authority, like legacy banking, and flow directly toward network-based environments. The mandate heavily targets three main areas: tokenized assets, decentralized compute, and global connectivity infrastructure. In a world where the illusions of international law are collapsing, the report argues that these decentralized protocols will become the only viable framework for global trade.
Ultimately, the report leaves us with this pretty stark realization. The path to 2032 demands the realization that the pre-2020 world is irrecoverable. The source material insists that anyone attempting to defend the old structures of 1771 is just going to be swept away. Success in this coming era requires embracing high volatility, not as a bug, but as a defining feature of the Great Reconstruction. It completely challenges us to rethink where value comes from, shifting our focus to a decentralized, algorithmic, and highly transparent global civilization. As we hurtle toward 2026 and beyond, the question isn't whether the system will change. The question is, are you positioned for the new Venusian paradigm?